to the the podcast. That word, I do not think it means what you think it means. And today we are discussing green passports and all the implications of that for liberty. So I'm Matthew, aka Ranger Lud, and this is Shimon, my co-author. Um, and that's our book. I do not think that word means what you think it means. And I think this is a book that everybody needs more and more. Every single day, I'm concerned that tensions are escalating and people are dehumanizing each other because they're not even using words to mean the same things. And that is certainly at a high boil point with respect to the vaccines, which really is a separate issue. And I want to try to pull them apart a little bit. And then there's the actual vaccine passports, or green passport is what they call it in Israel. So I wanted to start off there.
Before we launch into the topic of the day, maybe it's worth a moment to unpack kind of what you mean by that words not meaning what people think they mean, and what impact that has, in your opinion, on society.
Say that again. Like what do you mean?
Yeah,
What
like
means?
back to the you said something that people need the book more and more every day, and kind of wanted to just give a kind of a moment to recap kind of the thoughts behind why we wrote the book, and how things work. Sorry to put you
Yeah.
on the spot.
No. Can you give your quick summary of
Yeah,
that?
sure. I mean, look, we got together. The podcast is just a kind of a natural migration of things, and we started talking. I get pretty much a year ago at this point, I think, and we started having really deep conversations about political issues, particularly, but also one of the first things we talked about was coronavirus and the Chinese versus the American response to it, and our different kind of uh, our different perspectives on it. And one of the things that we kept running into is that you would use a word, or I would use a word, and the other one, like I would use the word capitalism, and you immediately kind of like thought that I meant like a whole slew of other things than what I actually meant, which was basically, the notion that capital should be allocated where it's most efficient, um, and allocated by kind of private individuals, actors, or markets, if you will. And you took that to mean, the general. I mean, you could speak more to what you felt capitalism meant, but that's not for this episode. But the more we went through this, the more we realized that a lot of the words that we were using had different meanings. And what was worse was we would each um, assume that we understood what the meaning the other was using when they used a word, and that led us to a whole set of other assumptions. And that led us to conversations about kind of how things work on the internet these days, where everything is kind of short form, and so everything goes from 0 to like 1,000, like in a snap, right? Well, all of a sudden you said the word capitalism in a post, in a comment on a post, and all of a sudden you're Hitler or something like that. And that's kind of, I mean, at least for me, that was kind of this idea of this book is to kind of like I don't know, centralize, maybe the wrong word, but kind of,
Dehumanize.
yes, to increase awareness that the person on the other side of your conversation is certainly somebody else with a whole different set of kind of presuppositions and assumptions, and that good conversations can be had around those ideas without without jumping to conclusions. And it pays to ask, hey, what did you mean by that word? Is this, this is my understanding of that word.
Yeah, and I think it's important to us partly because it didn't need to be important. I don't know, at some earlier point, 10 or 20 years ago or whatever. There was a lot more room for discussions. There was polarization, but it wasn't off the charts like this. And I think both of us have identified a sort of existential risk to our entire civilization is this sort of catastrophizing assumption that anyone who disagrees with you at all is the other extreme enemy to everything that you hold sacred in the world.
And on that note, Um, green passports. You had a lot of kind of visceral feelings about this topic. You live in a country where green passports are a thing. I was recently in that country and did not really encounter them. I didn't have one, nor did I have a need for one at the time, because I lived in a country where vaccines were not readily available anyway, and nor would the authorities in your country recognize if I had a vaccine, even if I came with papers. But I don't know kind of what's going on there on the ground. How regularly impactful is this, and what are your feelings about it?
Yeah, it is and it isn't. There's I'm invited to a wedding next week, so it's the first time it's really come up with something that's important to me. Is that when I was invited, there was nothing about it, but when I looked at the follow up little RSVP form, it said that the venue was only letting people in who have a green passport. So either I go to my friend's wedding and try to get in, I get tested the day before and hope that's enough. I tried to call them, I haven't gotten through. So it's up, it's a real thing, and it's like, if you can imagine doing something as important as a wedding and some members of your wedding party aren't able to come because they don't have this document. And again, so let's also make a couple distinctions. The document doesn't mean that you got vaccinated or not. It means that you want this particular document that proves that you've been vaccinated. So you could have been vaccinated and simply never gone through the process to get a green passport. But you can also get the green passport if you've had COVID, and then you can prove that you have these antibodies. So in either of those cases, you have a few months of this green passport right to go into certain establishments, which includes restaurants, pools, God, I don't know, all sorts of things. Everything from certain cultural events and government things to sex parties. I don't know. You need this to get in. So seeing it actually, so I want to also make the distinction. I don't want to have an argument right now, not that we would argue about this necessarily, but I'm not arguing against the vaccine. I'm not arguing for it particularly, but I'm not trying to claim that it's some, conspiracy to put microchips in all of us and make us 5G slave lizard people. I think it seems quite like a promising new thing that might make many people more immune, at least to the first strains that it was designed for. And I'm happy to see that. I'm happy to see that it's been correlated in Israel with a big decline in COVID infections. So we're not having the argument about like the vaccine is simply evil. We're now talking about the things about coercing people to take it, and what do you do to the people who don't take it if you implement a policy like a green passport?
Well, so what's the, if you are of the belief that the vaccine and being vaccinated is the only thing that kind of protects society from further and sustained outbreaks of COVID, then like, what is an alternative to having a green passport system? What's an alternative to kind of to ensure public safety? I guess this ultimately comes down to public safety versus liberty debate. And I imagine actually, I just to be clear, I think you know this directly. I'm in the moment playing kind of a devil's advocate role because I don't necessarily agree because I am more liberty kind of focused. But I'm just wondering, like, what's the alternative?
I agree. Well, in the sense that I agree, I want to make it liberty focused, and I wanted to therefore put the vaccine conversation to the side and focus on the liberty conversation.
So specifically within liberty, how do you both protect? Let's take for a moment this assumption, right, that the vaccine is good, great, and wonderful, and it is the thing that is protecting the state of Israel from massive and continued COVID infection. How do you keep that going? And it is a thought experiment, right? How do you keep the power of that going without having some kind of enforcement mechanism?
Right. And I don't look, I don't have an answer. I did want to pull apart. There was a lot of beliefs in your hypothetical, and I see those beliefs among a lot of my friends, which is A, that the vaccine is like the heroic white knight coming to the rescue of everybody. That also implies that COVID itself is this existential threat to civilization. We should all be cowering in fear and in permanent social isolation until we have a vaccine. Also, that none of the other treatments and measures that have been taken to minimize it help enough for us to go back to normal life. So the only thing we can do is to vaccinate, and we have to vaccinate everybody, or at least close enough to everybody that we achieve herd immunity. So that's the assumption. And like, I want to pursue your thought experiment, but I just wanted to pull apart that it has a couple of beliefs.
Oh, huge, huge, and it doesn't represent doesn't represent my personal beliefs, but we can get into that later if you like. You know, I'm pretty clear on my kind of COVID, how I feel about the whole thing, including the vaccines and everything, and I'm happy to get into that. But for now, for the moment, I think we're talking specifically about the liberty restriction of kind of green passports. That's kind of what you wanted to talk about. So let's like.
Yeah. So I kind of want to quote of I posted a probably the most political thing I've posted on my Facebook wall in quite a while, and I put it on the thread of this conversation on Facebook. It's the guy wearing a mask, and he says, "If we all just accept a medical surveillance state, we can get back to normal."
Yeah.
And that does sort of summarize kind of the hypothetical that you were saying, and that's launched a giant shitstorm flame war on my wall. But there was a few gems in the responses, in the comments of my friends, and I wanted to highlight one of them because I just thought that he actually said it better than me. He said, and I guess it was a public discussion. I don't know if I won't say his name. Anyway, he said, with COVID, the world got more dangerous. It happened, meaning there was no choice involved. COVID's in the world. We don't need to double down on that by significantly increasing state control and fracturing society to make us a little safer from one particular disease. And that said what I was trying to say quite a bit more compactly. And I'm wondering why it's not more obvious to people that even if you believe, like you said, even if you believe the vaccine is the greatest thing since chopped bread, first of all, you're assuming that medical privacy is just no longer a thing. Suddenly, that's just gone. Anyone can ask anyone else their vaccination status. Somehow that's not in the category of medical privacy. So I don't know how that happened. I don't know how we didn't even have that discussion.
Well, all right. You don't have that in the country you live in, and that's something that people forget. You know, civil rights and real liberty is not really a value, and never really was a value in the state of Israel. Well, it's a kind of rapidly shifting definition that's defined either by the then sitting Knesset or the then sitting Supreme Court, and they kind of make up their minds willy-nilly because there's no real constitutional protections. There's no real aspiration to liberty in general. There are some, what they call basic human rights laws, which are then changeable with the simple vote of Knesset. So you live in a country where you actually don't have rights, and so this is kind of a first time where you're kind of running into an expression of them, or the Israeli public, first time in a long time the Israeli public is running into an expression of them that they really find problematic and difficult to grapple with. But it's not a new condition.
Fair. It's not the first time I've encountered issues with the rights here, or in America for that matter. But in America, you have let's just say it's a more mainstream understanding of the rights that you have. You do have rights in Israel, but they, like you said, it's not commonly understood or enforced as much as it is in America. Although in America, I'm sure we can have a whole separate podcast about how far we are from the actual rights that we allegedly have in the Constitution.
100%.
I don't think either country is anywhere near the laws on its books.
So just circling back to the argument. So it's not. So the conversation that you want to have, I think, or that we're having, is about about kind of what the appropriate response is to COVID, right? I mean, that's really kind of what it comes down to. There was an interesting piece, although I don't necessarily disagree with the author across the board. There's an interesting piece in this morning's kind of Wall Street Journal opinion piece where he kind of quantified the case fatality rates across age groups, and then he did this kind of quote unquote cost benefit analysis, which is a bit absurd because it's kind of an overly simplistic model. But he basically said, look, if you're 18, your case fatality rate is 0.0004%. And if you kind of calculate that out, it comes out to kind of an average loss of 7.5 years of your life. Like if you go across the 7.5 hours, not years. But if you go to an 85-year-old, the case fatality rate is like I don't remember the number, but it is like that works out to like 60 days or something like that of life if you kind of multiply out the probabilities. And he says, well, so the cost, if you just kind of assume the cost, he's like, and what are we doing? Like, how much have we changed our lives over the last year to kind of save that 7.5 hours for the young, right? And how much is the value for the old? And his main point was, from the very beginning, we knew that this virus was something that primarily attacks old people, right? It kills young people also, but it's much, much more deadly to older people. And we failed pretty much around the world to identify the real enemy and threat, even though we knew very early on exactly that. And this is something you and I talked about way back a year ago. And that is, if you want to minimize the impact of the virus, then you need to primarily focus on protecting the elderly and the high risk, so people that have specific comorbidities, et cetera. And then you need to focus all your protection there and let the rest of society more or less operate freely. The cost, the younger you go on the spectrum, the costs associated with what we have done to combat COVID are way, way higher, right, than the benefits. And so now you're socializing those costs, right? The actual costs to those who actually have a benefit across all of society.
Right. I think you're making a kind of America-centric description of that, because the things that we did and the costs of it have been, let's just say, distributed quite a bit differently, but also varying success in different countries. Like in China, there was a very short lockdown, and then almost everything reopened. Demographically, they didn't have as many old people, and definitely didn't have as many fat people. And they were able to reopen by more than a year ago and have continued to remain open, and life is almost normal and in some ways better than before. I think we were discussing they've had 18% growth in the first quarter of this year.
Well, but the cost of that is way more than just medical surveillance.
True.
Like in China, like you are under complete and total surveillance. And that's how they can, it seems to me, and it's hard to know exactly what's going on in China because the records don't make a lot of sense and there's not a lot of transparency in the data. But if I understand correctly, the way that they are controlling COVID in China is with a extremely technological contact tracing solution in which they can just, if your phone was in the proximity of somebody who had COVID, you could just disappear. And that's the extreme, but they could just knock on your house in the middle of the night and take you away to some quarantine shelter. I don't know exactly what they're doing, right? Well, but they are, as soon as they discover a case of COVID, they are locking that case down and all of its tentacles so that it cannot spread within society. And they're doing that with an extreme level of surveillance, which way exceeds the green passport thing that we just talked about.
Yes and no. I mean, in functional terms, on a day-to-day basis, it didn't. I was there until September of last year, and it wasn't. Well, for one thing, the costs weren't high because that whatever degree of surveillance state they have there, it was already in place before COVID. So there was very little ramp up cost. They basically just created an app that associated with.
Well, did you know anybody in China that had COVID?
I did, yeah.
Okay. And anybody who were you close with that person?
No.
Right. So
there was. This is going to sound strange, but there was a much higher degree of transparency in China than there is in the West, and I actually trust it. But I can only say that because I was physically there. I got tested regularly, and then every time I traveled around China, I went to inspect factories and things. I would go to another town, another city. I'd get to the train station or the airport of that other city. Guards at the airport would show me the statistics and every single case in their province. And then I'd get to the factory and they'd show me or give me access to the recent negative tests of every single person in their factory. So the level of bending over backwards to be super transparent was stunning. And second, I don't think they had the weird negative incentives. I don't trust the numbers in a place like Israel. I don't know what it's like in America, but in Israel, there were so many negative incentives to have a positive test. Like, because then they did have kind of a weird half-assed kind of enforced lockdown for people in Israel who test positive, and everyone who they admit that they saw in the 5 or 6 days before they tested positive. So even when someone would test positive, they would usually lie about who they had been around. And very often they would avoid getting tested at all because they didn't want to have to miss work. And it was just like the incentives were so perverse that I don't trust any of the numbers here because nobody wants to suffer the consequences of it. And that also speaks to a whole other level that just simply having COVID and maybe getting treated for it or maybe just staying home and having chicken soup is less for most people than the costs, the social costs and the enforcement costs of letting the authorities know that you tested positive. So you're starting from a baseline of perverse incentive, bad policy, ineffective contact tracing in Israel.
Yeah, for sure. But
yeah, okay. Look, speaking to your bigger point, you're right. We have to do something. It's funny to say we, like as if we're in charge, but we are
We're not.
We, meaning everybody listening to this, everybody plays a part in making these policies a reality. When everybody ignores a policy, it's not a policy, right? If every restaurant decides to not use the green passport, which like I think in Italy, all the restaurant owners got together and just opened one day in defiance of the government. And the government had to back down because they couldn't fine every single restaurant in the country. So there is room for civil disobedience protests to make a difference. Probably not in China, but at least in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that. So I guess the question is then, I mean, once again, I think we've completely botched the whole COVID thing over and over and over again. And you're correct. My view is kind of U.S. centric, but I think it applies also kind of to Israel and pretty much every other kind of place that I've kind of studied closely. But
right, well, the countries that are succeeding don't make the news. So sub-Saharan Africa, Japan, and Taiwan, we just don't talk about anymore.
Although Japan, I recently read, is having a large uptick. Although I don't know what large is because what numbers are is often suspect as we said before. Yeah, it went
from 0 to 100.
Right, which is a huge increase.
Percentage-wise, right.
From 0, it's infinite, right?
But to take it back to sort of your original question, let's assume for a second that the pro-passport advocates are right. And everyone who is unvaccinated, A, will somehow instantly get infected with every variant, and B, spread it, and therefore D, is an existential threat to life of every single person, vaccinated or non-vaccinated. So therefore, we should do this systematic exclusion of the non-vaccinated from the places that the vaccinated go so that the vaccinated can go back to some sort of normal life. So let's assume that's true for a second. Even if it was true, this comes back to what my friend posted. It's like, let's assume that's true. Let's assume they're totally right, and every single person who's hesitating about the vaccine is irresponsible, dangerous, reckless, basically doing the equivalent of, driving down the street, shooting an assault rifle indiscriminately. Okay, well, great. Let's say that's true. And let's say we want to exclude them from the downtowns of every city, and you can't enter with, wherever this vaccine passport is going. Can't go to restaurants, can't go to the pool, can't go to the gym, can't go to, wherever. Where should they go? Should they all just, like they, meaning the 40% of the population that apparently is, as they call it, vaccine hesitant, and at least, half of them are just going to refuse to get it? In America, that's 100 million people? That's too many people to fit in the Japanese internment camps. You know what I mean? Like, what are you going to do? Let's assume you're totally right and the vaccine passport is the way to go. Are you just going to exclude 100 million people from every part of meaningful life for at least the next year or two? Like, where does this end? I feel like I want to just walk people through the consequences of their actions. It's so insane to me.
While that sounds insane and absurd, coming on the heels of the year that the world has just been through, I mean, like, things that I would have thought never would fly just 13 months ago, right, may fly today, oddly, in the world. I mean, the world is changing so rapidly. In many, many different kind of contexts. And so that may be kind of the natural end state of it. I don't know. I mean, I have a child who's in Israel. She's in the 9th grade. She's less than 16 years old. So as of right now, not in the vaccination crowd, but they are very closely, shortly talking about opening it up, and they're pushing for me to vaccinate my 15-year-old daughter. And to be perfectly honest, I think that that's absurd. Like, I literally think it's absurd to vaccinate 15-year-olds. And the reason I think it's absurd to vaccinate 15-year-olds is because the risk to 15-year-olds is literally zero. And the risk of intervention is unknown, but probably also close to zero, right? But if I have two paths, one that has an intervention and one that doesn't have an intervention, I'm going to choose the path of zero intervention. Because at 15 like I said, like, have 15-year-old kids, gotten severe COVID? Yes. Does it happen? There may be a handful of cases around the world in which it's happened, but there have also been cases of, side effects of the vaccine, and lots and lots of unreported side effects of the vaccine. And I'm not even, I'm just going to suggest that it's probably safe, but it probably has some side effects. Certainly has some side effects. And since like, I don't see a reason to go out and vaccinate somebody who's young and healthy. It just doesn't make sense to me. I personally don't have a problem with the vaccine for myself. And I think that whether or not you take the vaccine should be kind of a decision based on your risk weighting of kind of what your risk is to COVID and from COVID. But what's even more absurd in this conversation is they keep telling you over and over and over again that vaccinated people can carry COVID, and do. So the whole green passport system to me is absurd just on that face, because just because you have a green passport doesn't mean that you're not carrying COVID somewhere and spreading it.
Yeah, all the more so. So we've discussed this in other contexts, but I believe that our world is kind of awash in propaganda. And having lived in China, it sort of gives you a certain immunity to propaganda. Like, it becomes very clear what language is being used and what arguments are being used, whether they're sort of propaganda arguments or fact-based arguments. So, I want to kind of strongman the um, the desire to vaccinate even children. I'm hesitant to agree with it, but I can understand like the manipulative propaganda would say like children are grandma killers, that they're going to spread it to their grandmothers, even if they don't have any risk to themselves. So that's one argument, is they're going to spread it to their at-risk grandmothers or fat relatives or whatever, right? Then there's another argument that says that there are unknown, if you do get COVID and asymptomatically, there are unknown long-term risks to having it in your system. And there is at least some evidence that the long-term risks of having COVID in your system is worse than having the vaccine in your system. And we don't have long-term studies for either one. So do you want COVID in your system long-term, or do you want the vaccine in your system long-term? And that is, not a choice that really anyone has an absolute answer for. What I'm seeing infecting the world is this disease of certainty. That's what's scaring me more than the disease and more than the vaccine. It's like when people get really, really certain that they're right and really, really certain that other people are existential dangers to themselves. Like, I compared the vaccine passport to like a Jim Crow thing, because you're literally asked to sit at the back of the bus. You're literally asked you can't sit inside the restaurant. You have to sit outside on the shitty table on the curb. Like, how is that not at least uncomfortably similar to Jim Crow? And I think this could be going a lot worse place. When people think that other people are impure and dangerous, I mean, how long until some bad things start happening, whether mobs or government, mistreating people with the blessing of the purists?
Well, I don't have an answer to that question, since we live in a world where we've seen mobs form rather rapidly in the last year. And so, I mean, I guess the answer that's going to follow the strongman notion of your argument is that the difference between Jim Crow and green passports is that it's voluntary. In that you can opt out of being in the non-green passport status through a relatively simple action.
Right, and I understand that. I mean, look, when I used Jim Crow, I used it to refer to not just American treatment of blacks, but also to past discrimination against all sorts of people who weren't physically distinguished. So, no Jews or dogs allowed was a sign on a lot of restaurants and country clubs and everything else until fairly recently. I mean, the entire world passport system, some people say the biggest reason that it was created around World War I was to keep Jews out. So I wasn't just saying Jim Crow, and a lot of those people did have a choice. If you were a Jew, you could choose to convert, and then maybe you could get into that country club. Or you could pretend to not be Jewish. And even a lot of black people, they could pass for white. And, it's not like there's still not groups that are discriminated against like that in the world. And I do think the green passport has the potential to turn into something like that. Unfortunately, in America, it's become not that, as far as I can tell, vaccine hesitancy is actually correlated to the political parties. It seems like Republicans are about twice as likely to be vaccine hesitant, but there's plenty of Democrats and independents who don't want it either, and don't want the vaccine passport. But if it is perceived as correlating with that, I mean, the level of dehumanization I've seen between Democrats and Republicans is off the charts. And I mean, you've lived in Israel, I've lived in Israel. I don't remember the level of hatred of Jews towards Arabs ever approaching the current sort of Democrat hatred of Republicans that I'm seeing. I could be wrong, but I don't remember it ever being that bad.
No, it's pretty bad. At least on the internet. I think on the street it's a little different for the most part. I think that part of the problem, which kind of circles back to what led us to writing our book, is that kind of online discourse has kind of degenerated because of kind of the anonymity, and people are willing to say things to each other on the internet that they would never say to each other's faces, ultimately. And so, whether or not there's actually a real kind of whether that hatred persists and spills over into reality, I mean, I think clearly on some level, yes, right, there is an uptick, but I don't think it's kind of as broadly distributed in society as perusing Twitter or Facebook might suggest.
Look, I hope you're right. I mean, past genocides have a media incubation period. I mean, most Germans were hearing Hitler speak on the radio for a decade before it became violent, and most of them didn't know Jews in their everyday life, but the ones who did, I mean, intermarriage rate between Germans and Jews was pretty high, actually, and a lot of people got along with Jews in their everyday life and then cooperated in sending them off. Same thing with the Hutus and the Tutsis. The radio played this huge part. There was about a 3 or 4 month period where they were on the radio every day saying what they were going to do, and then they went and did it. So I have an understanding that the threshold for turning ordinary people into, I mean, even if we're not saying there's going to be a genocide, I think the Japanese internment camps is a much better parallel. It's sort of saying there's this war on, we don't know how long it's going to go on. These people are allegedly dangerous, even though they weren't. But we have this sort of proxy reason for being terrified of them. And so we're going to lock them up in a camp far away. I mean, I don't think there's a philosopher named Robert Nozick who's like kind of an anarchist-ish philosopher. I'm not really an expert on his stuff, but I remember he said something really cool about, well, not cool, but a nice definition of like homelessness. That like, you can't really outlaw homelessness, right? If someone's not paying rent anywhere, then they're not living anywhere, but they are living somewhere. They are there in the street or in the park or in the corner of your yard or hiding behind the garbage dumpsters or wherever. They are somewhere. And if you make laws, and there are a set of laws that are sort of disguised, but they're basically anti-homeless laws. So you can't urinate in public. But if you only live in public, where are you supposed to urinate? Where are you supposed to poop? If there's no public bathrooms, I mean, what? If you can't do the things that are the most basic essentials, which is basically sleep, poop, and pee, if you're not allowed to do those things in public, we're basically legislating you out of existence. We're saying your existence is illegal.
Well, I think you can legislate against homelessness. It's just it's limited to a place, right? So the laws, the anti-homeless laws, tend to be municipally specific. You can't live here.
Yes, but you're smiling because you know that any one place that does that tends to provoke similar laws in the neighboring municipalities until those laws are everywhere. So, you can't outlaw people from existing and breathing. Here's a relevant thing. You can't outlaw people from breathing. So, at a certain point, if you don't want people existing and breathing, what are you going to do with them? So that's what really scares me about this vaccine passport is that, like, they're just like, oh, well, you can choose to not go to the movies and you can choose to not go into restaurants and you can choose to not go to, take airplanes and you can choose to not. But at a certain point, that crosses over into your rights of freedom of movement. We've been through this in fighting Jim Crow that actually establishments do have to serve you. Right?
In America. Yeah, I think the green passport thing in America is not going to get anywhere. It will not have legs. Certainly not nationally, probably not even locally in most places.
I heard they're already implementing it in New York.
It's very possible. I would, places like New York and California, I can see some amount of implementation. I see very little likelihood of actual enforcement here in California, although large scale venues have not reopened, and it's possible that those might come with these kind of requirements. I don't really see it happening in California yet. I certainly don't see it happening on a national scale. I think it would completely gut the airline industry that's already on its heels if they tried to implement a national green passport rule to fly. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, the airlines, you'd have to nationalize. I mean, look, stop, scratch, reverse that. If we take a look at the broader political moment in which the current party that's in control, even though they have a very, very slim majority, is trying to vastly reshape society, and kind of take that to its logical conclusion, yes, they may go ahead and do things like nationalize the airlines and fly them at a loss, and implement their green passport policy. I haven't heard this rhetoric yet coming out of the White House, but it's possible. I think there'll be pushback, and I don't think it'll last.
Look, I hope you're right. Well, about the first part, meaning that it won't get very far. But I have heard pro-business arguments that, like, ooh, well, the business wants to reopen and they have a right to reopen with this green passport thing, and that's going to give customers confidence to come back. It's going to give customers confidence to fly if they know everybody else is vaccinated on the flight.
So I think any business is welcome to do that, and the businesses will have to kind of follow the winds of change and see where that is. But today, flights are full. Flights have been full for quite some time, and part of that has to do with kind of a hugely reduced flight schedule. I mean, I've flown since COVID started probably 8 times, I think. More than 8 flights. I mean, I went to Vegas a couple times. I went to New York once. I flew to Israel, which involved going through Chicago and Toronto, and all of these were obviously round trips. So I've been around, and I'll tell you that flights are not empty, right? And there are no green passports. Now, there is a requirement in many instances for flying, especially internationally, to present a negative test. So it's not a domestic requirement. And so if they take that negative test and they say, well, if you have a certified green passport, you don't need a negative test, right? That's something I can see happening for flying. But I don't see the airlines saying, oh, if you don't have a green passport, no, you can't. And even in Israel, supposedly, or at least as of a month ago when I was there, some of the hotels were saying the same thing. It was like, you can come in with a green passport or a negative test that's within 24 hours. And so so now you're in a position of you who would be, not you personally, but a person who would be vaccine hesitant and doesn't want to go get a vaccine or a green passport has some recourse to, because at the end of the day, what they're supposedly trying to accomplish, which I definitely believe in Israel and other places that not as much, is they're trying to prevent the transmission of the disease, right? And so they're saying a green passport is a proxy for you're safe from transmitting the disease, and so therefore you're welcome to join the establishment, come into an establishment. And if there's just a matter of convenience, although testing in Israel is also extremely convenient right now.
Right. That's actually one of those areas where, so when I was in China, I asked friends who had been there for much longer, how do you know what's really going on? When you're getting sort of state official Pravda censored versions of things, which is surprisingly a narrow range of topics. I actually felt like I was getting more reliable news about more subjects in China. There's just certain things off the table, but it's very explicit that those are the things that you're not going to get a straight story about. So Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Tiananmen Square. You just can't talk about those things. Any information or conversation about those things is not welcome or heavily redacted. And if you talk about them too much, you can get deported from the country, or if you're Chinese, you can get in trouble. But everything else is kind of fair game. So my friend said that, like, if it's anything related to those things, you just have to judge by the government's actions rather than its words. So a couple things have happened to me that make me really mistrustful of the actions with respect to this. One is that the health minister, or I don't know if it was the Minister of Health here or somebody in the decision-making committee of Israel about the Ministry of Health, said that they were going to make those 24-hour tests far more expensive and more difficult to get. And that was like a huge alarm bell for me, because it was like, oh, you don't actually care about keeping people from spreading the disease. You just want to coerce everybody to get the vaccine. And I'm sure he would agree with that. But that's where I was like, whoa, this is not medicine now. This is bullying. And the other thing was that I actually went, there was a, when they first started giving the vaccine here, I went with a friend to get it in the big stadium. And I actually moved back to the country only last September from China. So you have to wait 6 months to get your healthcare fully reinstated, because they don't want Israelis who live abroad to just come back, get healthcare, and leave. That's sort of their system works on a socialized medicine. So if you live here and you pay taxes, you get good medicine. But if you don't live here, they don't want you taking advantage of the system. Okay, I respect that. So I was still in that waiting period. So it was January. So it was only 4 months. So I knew I didn't officially have healthcare yet, but I knew I was in their system. And the vaccine, they're trying to vaccinate everybody, right? It's like, it's not necessarily that you're benefiting from whatever, right? Like, apparently if I'd gone another day, it wouldn't have been a problem. But I got there and they were like, oh, no, you're not in our system in the way that we can track everything. So we're not giving it to you. And I was like, what? Like, I thought you really, so it was like, oh, what you really are doing here with this early, huge rollout of the vaccine is a favor for Pfizer to do basically clinical testing on the scale of a country. I'm just judging the action. I could be wrong, but that makes more sense based on what actually happened, based on judging by the actions. So we're all living in this world where everything is spun and spun and spun and spun, and I feel like the only thing we have to go on is the actions. So that's where it does. I don't want to buy into these conspiracies that the whole thing is to aimed at taking all our civil liberties away and feeding us to the aliens. But at some point, I'm going to start to feel like the actions don't make enough sense with respect to COVID, but they do make sense with respect to, like, implementing a China-style totalitarian superstate.
I think I think the anecdote that you kind of present with that specific representative, I don't know that kind of speaks to the broader actions of the population, of the government. That minister, I don't remember the guy's name, but I heard that same anecdote about the guy who wanted to make testing a lot more expensive. Clearly was about coercion. I don't really buy the Pfizer conspiracy. I think it's true. I think that Israel bumped itself to the front of the vaccine line by having a very good way to track all of their citizens' medical records. They don't have HIPAA in Israel, right? Correct. So Israel presented a competitive advantage to Pfizer as a rollout candidate. It's a relatively small country with really, really good medical records. And so I think that's true. I mean, now, is that a cynical or a problem? I don't necessarily buy that as much, because I think that the idea of the vaccine is to eliminate COVID at the end of the day. This is not some to believe something different would mean that you'd have to believe that Pfizer was somehow behind the spread of COVID so they can get, vaccines and sell billions of, doses of vaccines around the world, or something. To me, that seems, personally, to me, that seems a little kind of on the far end of the absurd spectrum, but I don't know. I mean, I think that
I agree.
Pfizer's a company that's trying to take a situation that the world is in. They've invested a lot of time, energy, and money into finding a good solution for that, and I think they did the best they can in a very, very quick period of time.
Yeah,
and so
those can be both true, meaning, I worked for the pharmaceutical industry, and some people have heard of the repeatability crisis. It affects a lot of things in science. It affects pharmaceutical drug trials. It affects all kinds of clinical experiments. It affects like a lot of social science experiments where you get some super interesting finding, but it turns out nobody can actually succeed in repeating the experiment. So, a lot of incentives for pharmaceutical companies to cherry pick a study that seems to indicate a positive thing. It's been extremely notable with respect to the SSRIs, like antidepressants, don't do better than a control group when you try to do repeatability studies, but they do have real side effects. So, these are billions of dollars products that have been given at this point to billions of people, and there's so much antidepressants it's affecting the water supply and even the fish. When you test the fish, they have high levels of Prozac. So, we do live in an age where we should not treat the pharmaceutical companies as benign, neutral implementers of the scientific method. Now, I also agree with you that the vaccines are, being implemented in hundreds of countries with their own relatively independent, establishments in science, that I don't think they would all go along with a hoax. I do believe that the vaccine, like you said, we're judging by the actions. So it doesn't make sense for the vaccine itself to be a conspiracy. It does seem to be a well-intentioned emergency authorization to do its best to prevent the capture and spread of the virus. But that doesn't mean I trust the pharmaceutical companies, and I can see huge disincentives to admitting side effects, etc.
Oh yeah, I don't disagree with any of that.
So I think you had a couple bigger thoughts, and I feel like I haven't really. I feel like we're disagreeing with less than usual, maybe because I'm coming over to the dark side where I actually think that liberty is important. But maybe you can take it a little further. One of the last things I said to sort of check out of the flame war on my Facebook page was that if we let the measures of this, fighting COVID literally force families apart for years on end, and exclude huge numbers of members from positive participation in society, the terrorists win. Like, you can't give up your civil liberty. There's a point beyond which you're harming your society more than the damage being done by the virus in this case, or the terrorists in that case.
Oh yeah, I think we passed that point a long time ago. I've been outspoken on that for well on a year now. I think COVID is a real disease. It's terrible. It has some really, really bad effects on people, but it's not really stoppable and controllable at the end of the day. Maybe this virus mitigates it. At what cost? I'm not sorry. So maybe the vaccine mitigates it. Probably, I would even say the vaccine mitigates it. At what cost? I'm not sure, and nobody's sure because it's all very new. But I think cost benefit analysis never went into this kind of equation, and I think that's, to me, that's a problem.
Well, it is, but I want you to talk a little bit more about we tend to not put a dollar value on liberty. We tend to not put any sort of direct measure on okay, well, now when I go to the airport, I have to take my shoes off and get x-rays and, have someone pat me down, but that's okay. So that was a trade-off we made that had a cost to our liberty to run and catch a train, a plane at the last second. It doesn't seem like that big of an imposition, but it is a real thing. So what is this liberty that we are losing?
So, again, and it's hard. It's hard to really. It's something you can't really, I think, quantify. If that makes sense, very difficult to quantify. But I would agree that
or even define it, in some way.
What is liberty?
Well, in this context, I feel like the Green Passport has taken away significant liberty from a lot of people, and the other measures, the lockdowns and other things. So but what is this that we're losing? Because I feel like not having it defined, and yes, not having it quantified, makes it easy for them to take it away from us.
Yeah, although moving forward from there, you end up with kind of ultimately a slippery slope argument, right? It's just this, and then sooner, before you know it, you end up in in the gulag or something like that. But I think that it's interesting to me. Like I said, we talked a little bit a while back today. I just lost my train of thought. I apologize.
Define liberty. That's all. Just sum up the Constitution and the ideals of several thousand years of philosophers in one
sentence.
2 sentences.
2 sentences. I mean, ultimately, liberty is the in the American way anyway, is a God-given right to kind of live our life as we see fit. And not without undue influence from the outside and without hurdles put in the way of that. And 100%, green passports are an obstacle to liberty, as is taking off your shoes and airport security. And these things are constantly infringed, and living in a society is a negotiation between the extreme of liberty, where you can do anything you want, and living in an ordered society where everybody has kind of a set of agreed upon rules by which to abide. And then on top of that, you end up then there is governments kind of are granted the power to kind of try to mediate that delicately, and often fail to do so.
Yeah, I'm scared. I have to admit, I'm seeing the implementation of the Green Passport, and I'm more scared than I was a couple months ago. I'm seeing the vicious anger, not just online. I've seen it in person a couple times. There's just this intense. I feel like there's this story in people's heads that COVID is much more catastrophic than it is, and then have been told that the only way out of it, this goes back to our hypothetical at the beginning, that the only way out of it is for everyone to be vaccinated. And anyone not agreeing to get vaccinated is literally doing the same thing as punching you in the face.
Yeah, I think that kind of living in that Bill Maher thing you shared with me maybe a week and a half ago, where they kind of followed the political implications of how people estimate the danger of COVID over here. I'm posting that clip into our comment feed so people know what we're talking about. I think it's like 70% of Democrats think that the hospitalization rate of COVID is greater than 20%. If I remember, I could be completely misquoting this.
Right. When the real rate is under 5% or under 5%.
And that's just it. I mean, we have a fear complex that's been kind of built up in society around the world, and it always leads me to ask the same question that you just asked: is what is the purpose of this? Who benefits from it, and why? And what does it do to our personal liberties? And I think it's a problem. I think that yes, we have to figure out how to societally answer a global pandemic threat. I think part of the problem is the fact that this pandemic is not super deadly. And so therefore, the fact that we experiencing a pandemic and a lot of the public is witnessing a really poor response makes it all that much more dangerous when we have another pandemic that is more deadly.
That's an excellent point, like a cry wolf kind of thing.
Yes, because I mean, I live in Southern California, and in Southern California, we went into intense lockdown of March, April, May. And California never lifted it until like August. They started to like begin to lift kind of lockdowns and allow businesses to reopen and restaurants to kind of open up outside. And that was just, I mean, you had the will of the people. Like when this whole thing started, and you know, they came out with this idea of 15 days to stop the spread, and the president was out there, as unpopular as he was with public, and said, yes, we're going to do this. Fauci up there and Dr. Birx and everybody, we're going to do this 15 days to stop the spread. Everybody's going to stay inside. It's all going to lock down. There was intense compliance with that. I mean, compliance with that was pretty high, because you had that willpower. It was like, we're facing a threat. We don't know what it is. We don't know what the implications of it are. So let's take this kind of extreme step, right, for 15 days. And I think that 15 could have been 30, right? But at some point in that 15 days, the goalpost was moved from stop the spread so we don't overwhelm our medical system to we need to avoid every single COVID case, while seeing the statistics continue to roll in and notice that the virus is not that deadly. And so what you ended up with was, on the books in California, all the way up until August, there was, extreme lockdowns. But in reality, like, if you were out on the streets in late March, early April, there was nobody on the freeway. It was empty. Okay, I drove down. We have a place up in the mountains. I went and spent the month of April there because Passover was then. And I was just like, you know what? There's no reason to be here in the city, stuck inside. My kids can go and play in the woods. It was great. I had a great time. It wasn't as much about fear of COVID as more of like fear of spending a month in a reasonably small house with 4 children who were all kind of at each other's throats. I'd rather just give them the space. And when I drove down there, it was empty. Like, I didn't encounter any traffic. Like, I saw, like, the whole way it was wide open freeway, something you never see in Southern California. And it was, the compliance was intense because there was will. The will of the people was behind this idea of, there's a threat, we don't know what it is, let's evaluate. But just fast forward kind of 2 months later, with the kind of the hypocrisy of the authorities in the face of the Black Lives Matter protests, all of a sudden, yeah, sure, go outside, gather in mass. Like, you have to do that. And I don't have a problem with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that they, especially the ones that were protesting and not rioting, were surfacing some very kind of excellent points and things that need to be kind of addressed societally. But that hypocrisy coming from the government vis-a-vis COVID, it was like, you must stay in your house. You cannot go out for anything, but you can go to a mass protest with 10,000 people, right? And then when we didn't see a spike of COVID after that, it should have been at that point immediately obvious to everybody that COVID just doesn't spread outdoors, or it spreads a lot less outdoors. And so now you have this kind of intense lockdowns that you've had on the books. Officially, everything was locked down. Right. But in reality, like, people can see that there's no reason for it. And so compliance just plummeted, and traffic slowly came back, and people just went back to going about their lives. So even though on the books there was this lockdown, in reality, people were going out, they were doing all kinds of things. And at that point, by not relaxing the standards earlier, the government completely lost the will of the people. And I'm actually afraid that the next time something like that happens, you will just not have compliance from the get-go, because people are going to, have this lip service compliance, right, but not actual real compliance. And that puts the world in a much more dangerous place.
I agree. And there was another danger out of that, was that there was a perception that the left people who were going out and doing the Black Lives Matter and anti-Trump protests, it was like, oh, well, we're the good guys. We're the ones who are social distancing. They were protesting, but they were social distancing. They were a little more likely to wear masks. And so they're like, well, of course we didn't spread it because we don't have it. But when those Republicans go outside to protest the lockdowns, they're spreading it and they have it. I mean, I literally see people say this. And In Israel, it's been a little similar because they allowed the anti-Bibi protest to continue, which is, the elite of this country, the sort of media elite and everything, is very anti-Bibi, which is it's a tiny bit parallel to Trump in that sense that he was technically in charge. Now I'm in a minority government, but yeah, this cry wolf thing is really bad, and I do have some admiration for the Chinese in not allowing those memes to happen. I mean, they did a hardcore lockdown for everybody for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. Then they partially released it for a week. Then they released it less for another week, and then they went back to normal. And they never tried to reimpose it, except for very short times when, like, somebody brought a bunch of cases of COVID back in from abroad or whatever. They did lock down Beijing at one point for 8 or 9 days, but they never re-locked down Shanghai, which is where I was, or the other cities that I visited. So,
but the problem there, once again, Matthew, is that the way China has managed their COVID response is lack of liberty on steroids. And so, there is an inherent trade-off, right, between liberty and security, because one of the tenets of liberty is you are at the liberty of take care of yourself, right? And you have personal responsibility to take care of yourself. And so that is going to engender and come with a certain amount of risk, right? Personal risk. Whereas in China, they are more collectivist, right? The concept of liberty is not something that is important to them. And so therefore they're okay with the fact that the government tracks their literally every move and everything they say and everything they do online, and has the ability to just make people disappear. And I don't know that they do, although that the whole thing with the Uyghurs, is kind of disturbing, but and reminiscent of the Russian Gulag. But that's a trade-off at the end of the day. Like, liberty does come with risk. It's not a riskless endeavor, but liberty allows people to make their own assessments about risk.
Put it this way:
in the extreme.
Every American should be alarmed and ashamed that it's not as different as you would like, and that especially with respect to COVID, the Chinese restrictions on its people's lives has been less than in America by orders of magnitude. I will grant you, and look, there's other Asian countries that are less totalitarian that have succeeded, and I don't even know what the hell's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, except that they don't seem to have much COVID, and maybe it's because they're using ivermectin or whatever. But it seems pretty clear that, in America now, and this is also about the censorship on social media, which I'm also seeing around discussions of the Green Passport, you don't have as much liberty as you used to, that's for sure. It's not as heavy-handed as the Chinese government, but it's pretty pervasive. And, I don't think there's anything about our lives that's not surveilled as extensively, probably more extensively than the Chinese, just because we have more different technologies. But we have Google and Facebook and Waze, and every app asks for your location permission, and most of the places where you post online is either censored, like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, or if it's not censored, that's where you're probably dafka being watched, like specifically being watched, like Parler or Mew or whatever these new things are. I suspect those are being very, very heavily surveilled. Precisely because of that. So I want to agree with you in principle that America is still a much more free country, but in practice, it's a lot less different than it should be.
So I'm going to go back to a recurring theme, at least in my own thought processes, in that America has the most and best rights of any of people of any country in the world, but we're absolutely idiots as to how we think about them and apply them. And my favorite example of that is HIPAA, right? The Medical Privacy Act. Every time you go to the doctor, you have to because of this notion of medical privacy, you have to sign 16 forms waiving your medical privacy just to see a doctor. And then, but still, your medical outcomes are actually worse because doctors actually can't discuss their patients' cases with each other without getting a specific HIPAA release. And it's just ridiculous, right? And then contrast that with, I think, something like 40% of the US population has literally handed their genetic material to a private company.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, these are the, and I could be completely wrong on the statistic of how many people have. I think I read that somewhere. I could be wrong. It's just my recollection, but it's easily ascertainable. But it's a large proportion of the U.S. population that has done their genetics. And not when you hand over your genetics, you're not only handing over your own medical data, you're handing over your family's medical data. Like, I don't even have to do 23andMe for somebody to figure out who I am genetically, because it's enough that my grandparents did it or my uncle, right?
Yeah.
They can get enough. They can get enough of my private medical information just by the fact that somebody that's just even a couple steps removed from me did it. And so that's just kind of back to, and that's a whole obviously different conversation, but Americans do have the right to liberty, and we have set down certain rights to kind of enforce and protect that liberty. But over a long period of time, we've kind of lost sight of how to think about it and how to assess it at every step of the way. So it's ultimately to our detriment, and that needs to be rethought and re-understood by the broader population, in my opinion.
Wow. Well, I hope so. Maybe we can wrap it up kind of on that note. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would invite anyone who's listening who is absolutely convinced that vaccines and vaccine passports are the way to go, that, hey, Mazel Tov, I'm all in favor of you and as many people as possible. If the vaccine's helping, get it, especially if you're high risk. But please consider that going down the vaccine passport path can do so much more harm. And please try to back down from your absolute certainty that you know everything and therefore it's okay to exclude people and to assume that they're existential threats to you. It's just not a healthy way to live. I think the liberty that we're talking about, part of that is just being able to be living in dignity with mutual respect for other people and the potential to interact with them without fear and hatred. If you don't have that, you don't have liberty. And I think a lot of this fear of the disease is happening in your heads. And I think you can go back to normal life, especially if you're vaccinated. You should have no reason not to go back to normal life and not be afraid of anyone who's unvaccinated. You shouldn't even be afraid of someone who's coughing out corona. So, I invite you to start living your life with a little less fear.
Amen. And on that note, consider purchasing our book. I do not think that word means what you think it means. A Short Handbook of Misunderstanding. It's available on Amazon. I'm Shimon. This is Matthew, and we're all about having interesting conversations. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, and this is a good time that we have our name, the Fairness and Freedom Friends Foundation. That's more appropriate today than usual.
All right. Have a good one. Until next time.
Until next time.